All you, Erin.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone who's joined. And if you're watching the recording of this later on, thank you for watching the recording. We're really excited to have the next session of our virtual clinics over the winter. We have Alex Siegel here today to talk about Team Sprint, and I will pass it off to him. Sorry, actually, I will not pass it off to him. You're just a little bit of Zoom etiquette. Your video is off by default, so please use the chat if you have any questions. I will be moderating that and bringing those questions up to Alex. So we intend for this to be, collaborative and discussion based. And yeah, if you have questions for Alex, please bring them up and we'll make sure that we make time at the end for all of those.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Erin. I think just based on the names, I think I know most everyone. But welcome. Good afternoon. Thanks for carving out a little time to at least listen in or double task while watching the Seahawks. So yeah, I am Alex Siegel. A bit about me and the track. So I think first and foremost, I'm one of the coaches for the Jerry Baker Jr. Program, which is always a lot of fun. I guess I'm probably the most sprint focused coach amongst the group, but work with Amara, Taylor, Kenny to do that. I am a pretty focused sprinter when it comes to track racing. So I mean, sprint events. Kieran's are by far my favorite on a Friday night, and then I've done a fair bit of team sprinting over the last few years and found some success doing it. 2 elite bronze medals, a Masters World Championship team sprinting, 1 Masters National Championship team sprinting, and then I think last year, or I guess 2022 at the Grand Prix with a couple other friends, set the Masters track record in a team sprint during one of the evening sessions. So have done laps with friends, riding in triplets before. And so, it's a very, for as simple as it is, it's also a very structured event. And so, yeah, happy to talk about it and excited to get going. So in terms of agenda, I'm just going to walk you through, I think, some real basic principles, the things that kind of apply across the board, trying to get through some of the questions. I don't have a slide on it, but I think that'll be a good time to talk about exchanges. So effectively, going from one rider to another. Just some really simple stuff there. I'm not really going to talk about starts. Clearly, like a standing start is very much part of a successful team sprint, but I think that's a very different sort of animal and probably doesn't lend itself as much to a clinic like this. But if there are questions, then we can talk about it. I'm going to talk about the classic team sprints, so doing them on a 250-meter track. The reason for that is because most national championships, world championships now are being held on that event. I frankly think they're just more interesting because the shorter duration means you have to do a lot more thinking. As the race gets longer, it gets a lot simpler. So going to talk about that. There's kind of, I think, 3 different things I want to kind of point out in that. We'll get into it when we get into the slide. And then talk a little bit, of course, I think most everyone here, this is a, Jerry Baker Memorial Velodrome video clinic, so we will talk about it. But the spoiler alert for that is because it's 1,200 meters, you put on pretty big gears and you make sure that you're trying to just maintain the biggest or the highest speed for as long as possible. So with that said, let's dive in. All right. Basic principles of team sprinting. So first and foremost, team sprinting is actually all about risk versus reward, right? So you're trying to assemble the fastest team you possibly can, but you're trying to make sure that you get the final rider across the line in the shortest time possible. I realize, and I didn't even think about this until just now, maybe it's worth talking about how a team sprint actually works. And so this is probably known to most, but just to cover it really quickly, you line up 3 riders across the rider, at the bottom, so in the sprinter's lane, in a start gate on some tracks or being held, leads the first lap. The other 2 riders fall in behind. At the end of that first lap, they pull off. Second rider leads the second lap, pulls off. Third rider basically rides solo for the final lap. No matter what the track is, you're riding 3 laps. I think the one exception is, I believe in Detroit, they do 6 laps, so you do 2 laps in each position. But it's not a 750-meter race. It's not a 1,200-meter race. It is just 3 laps of whatever track you're on. So yeah, rule number 1 is protect your slowest riders, right? The way a fast team goes poorly in a team sprint is by blowing someone off the wheel and making them do a lot of distance without the protection of the draft. So number 1, make sure you're protecting riders and just trying to keep the team together as much as possible. That is why it is truly a team event. Number 2, I think a lot of people believe that P3 is the hardest. Effectively, the third position is the hardest one to ride because it's the longest. Second is the easiest, or middle, and P1 is the easiest. I'd say by and large, P1 is the easiest. But it's actually not necessarily true that the second position is easier than 3. The reason is because if you do it right, you're doing 500 meters with basically no time in the draft if you're getting absolutely nailed. Whereas the third rider will get to at least sit in the draft for the better part of the first 2 laps. So that is kind of just, I don't know if it's a principle, but let's just say it's something to keep in mind. Number 3, your team should be accelerating for the first half of the race. That is the goal. Really hard to do at our track, just given how long it is, but you want to be accelerating, and minimize deceleration, or as I put it, parking the bus, right? If you're putting a rider who's really dying in front and the rider behind has to slow down, that is the easiest way to kill speed, and it's extraordinarily difficult once you've built speed to regain it if you start slowing down. So you want to be moving, ramping up, and then dying basically as smoothly and as little as possible. Gear choice. So I'm going to kind of sprinkle this in different places, but it's critical for 2 things, right? It is critical for your speed, your overall speed, but it's also one of the best tools you have to think about how to protect a rider. So you can take a really fast person, and if you put them on a really big gear, it will kind of slow them down, at least from an acceleration standpoint. And so that can be a really big advantage. So if you really want to think about getting the right gearing and how you sort of use that as one of the tools along with your team order to sort of maximize your speed. And I will say here, and I'll show you some examples of this. Your gear choice also speaks to that sort of risk reward profile. So if you kind of gear down into easier gears, that actually might be a tiny bit faster, but it can also really put everyone on the knife's edge in terms of being able to stay on the wheels. So in a perfect world, right, if you get to do, if those of you listen to the Peace Take podcast, right, they ask about what's your dream team sprint construction or roster lineup. If you get to do that, right, and you get to pick Jason Kenny, Chris Hoy, Harry Lavrazen, Vicky Pendleton, right? If you get to have those choices, you would put your absolute fastest rider in your second position. So if you actually notice, the Dutch and the Australians, they'll have Harry Lavrazen and Matt Richardson, who are basically the 2 fastest guys in the world right now. They're going in P2. And the reason is because of that thing I was saying about trying to accelerate for the first half of the race. So they can get up to the absolute max speed. And then P1 is generally a really good starter. It's kind of a specialized position at that level. And P3 has a little bit more endurance of some form. In terms of gearing, again, this is on it for a 250-meter track. You'll put P2 on an 8 to 10 inch bigger gear than P1. And then P3 will be on a similar gear to P2, maybe slightly larger, but you're definitely not wanting to do an 8 to 10 inch jump unless you've got someone with the power like Jeffrey Hoogland to do it. I run a couple teams even where P3 will be on a slightly smaller gear than P2. And again, that's that protective mechanism to make sure that they can get off the line, get into the wheels, and even if it may not be perfectly optimal, it at least kind of has that protective factor. The last one, sorry, the slide's not perfect. We sort of jump into another sub-bullet on the other side. Position 1. So gear choice there is actually about 2 things. And I'll show you this on the next slide. It's not just lap time, it's lap time and your finishing speed. So it doesn't do a whole lot of good, coming back to this avoid parking the bus, to ride a really, really fast lap because you get out of the gate super well, but you're not accelerating through it. and your second half lap, you're sort of stuck stationary, and the rider behind you is stuck on the wheel. So you want to think about effectively like a trap speed, right? If you were to have like a speed gun coming into the line out of turn 4, you want to think about basically exiting that with maximum velocity possible, but still delivering a really good lap. I take a somewhat controversial view that I actually generally prize exit speed or finish speed after that first lap more than the actual lap time. All that said, we're amateur racers, right? We're not part of a national federation, so we don't get to like pick from a huge number of riders that we get to put together to assemble a 3-person team. So it's never a perfect world. If in doubt, these are sort of coming back to that protection factor. So you gear up your P1 rider, like I just said, right? It might be a slightly slower lap, but if it leads to a higher drop-off speed and everyone's tight on the wheels, that is a better strategy overall. So I generally err on the side of a slightly larger P1. Look, if you're going for Olympic gold, don't do that. But if you're just trying to race at Fred's or even get on the podium at Elite Nats here in the US, gear up your P1 a little bit maybe. And then if you absolutely have to, go slowest to fastest, meaning your slowest rider is your starter, your fastest rider is your P3. That is literally like the most low risk situation. All right, that was a lot. I'm checking and not seeing any questions in the chat, so I'm going to move on. Oh, I did say I was going to talk about exchanges. So before I switch slides, exchanges. So the rules have changed before, but the current rules as they are written is that the lead rider, so you cannot overtake. This is a firm rule. You cannot overtake. There's no judgment in this whatsoever, where the lead rider does not have their wheel in front as you cross the finish line, which is the pursuit line, right? So all team sprints start and finish at a pursuit line in the middle of the straight. So you absolutely have to have that lead rider finish ahead. There is I believe it is 10-meter distance that rider then has to basically get out of the way and stop leading. So you have to basically transition. The best way to, I think, do this to make sure that you're going to sort of ensure you don't get disqualified, kind of maximize the draft as much as possible, is as you come out of turn, so on a shorter track, it's as you're coming out of turn 4, right? If you've ridden Burnaby or a steeper track, like it kind of pushes you out anyway. Instead of fighting it to stay right down on the black line as the lead rider, you just kind of let it push you just a little bit up, and you sit just outside the sprinter's lane. And like the mental model I use to think about, if your left hand, so your inside hand, were directly over the sprinter's lane, that red line, that is a great position to be as you are the lead rider coming down the straight. You're full gas in that position. That allows, if you have a rider who's basically gaining speed, with his ideal in your second position, which is usually your transition from lap 1 to lap 2, not 2 to 3. But if that rider is gaining speed, they can kind of creep up alongside. They're still getting a good benefit of draft. It's not maybe as perfect as being perfectly in line, but they're still getting a good draft. But it's their responsibility to not pass you too soon. And then as soon as that rider hits the line, that rider being the lead rider, hits the pursuit line, go hard up track, but also still at full gas, right? So I will tell riders that the finish line for them to sort of ease up and relax is 5 to 10 meters past. But as soon as they hit that pursuit line, I want them banking hard up track to get out of the way, because the sort of are you out of the way or not can be a judgment call of the commissaires. If you just move up track really aggressively, it's really obvious. But also you don't want to shut it down too early, lest your teammate overtake you. So that's why I set that sort of effective finish line 10 meters past. That's exchanges. You do that for, it's really it takes, I'd say, a good amount of thought from rider 1 to rider 2. For 2 to 3, because you're kind of maintaining the same speed, you don't have a big speed differential. So it's usually not as complicated. But rider 1 to rider 2, because 2 is on usually a substantially bigger gear, hopefully they are coming at actually a much higher speed. And so they have to be pretty conscientious of making that change happen smoothly. Okay. I've never done this before where I just like monologue at a screen. But here we go. All right. These are three different things. So bear with me. I put them all in one slide. A, just because of space. B, because I think it's actually kind of interesting to look at them relative to one another. But if you try to look through everything all at once, it's going to be tough. So let me walk you through it. So I have up here two different times, and as you can tell from the speeds, so a net time of 43.1 and a net time of 41.6. These are world-class times. Team A on the left rode a 17.1 to start, ended up with a 43.1. Team B on the right rode a 17.0, so a little faster, but not much different, and then finished with a 41.6. Okay. What is very interesting to me about this is you are talking about a almost 1.5 second gap, right? That is enormous, with a very similar opening lap time. How is that happening? Why? Why is that the case? And you could look and be like, oh, well, Team A clearly, like, those riders are not as good. That'd be one thing. But actually, the answer is not that. And I just put a little call out, like, so Team B's second rider out qualified the same position in Tokyo by about 3 tenths. So like that explains some of the gap, but not all of it. It's not just ability. I'm going to sort of like lift the veil and tell you. So Team A is actually Team GB from, oh, I got to remember this now. I want to say 2012. This was an Olympic gold medal winning ride with Jason Kenny as P2. Team B is the Dutch at the last World Championships. So like when we are talking, this is truly world class, right? The best in the world at the time. The big difference here is gearing. So when I was saying earlier, you might take a slightly slower time on your first lap if you're exiting at a faster speed. This is why. If you take, so the gears are so different here. It's not a perfect example because Team B, so Roy Vandenberg still, ripped off a faster lap than I want to say is Phil Hindis. But they're going so much faster, and then they are carrying that speed that you're seeing these second and third laps. This is where they gain all their time, right? 6 tenths faster over the second lap, 8 tenths faster over the final lap. It's enormous. So this is the trend. Of course, if you've been following sprinting in particular over a number of years, like you've seen the trend towards bigger gears, but it really shows up in an interesting way in team sprinting because the long duration over which you're holding those speeds. Okay. I just throw that out there because I think it's a really cool story. It has no bearing on what happens at the US elite level because we're nowhere near that fast, right? So what I have in this second row are basically times from this year's nationals. And I'm not doing it to like talk about myself or talk about our team or anything like that. But because I was there and I know all these teams and I know the people who ride them and I know kind of what they're relatively good at or less good at, it's pretty easy for me to look at this and be like, here's how you can explain these differences across 3 teams. So we're going to start on the left. So that is basically the national team. They can't call themselves that when they race, so they went as Look Karima. That was the team name they gave themselves. So it's Josh Hartman, Dalton Walters, and Jamie Alvord. They actually rode with 4 riders. They had Evan Boone in there. I can't remember the exact order they did qualifying for finals in, but call it good enough. Next rider is basically the group from Edge. So Nick Roberts, Andrew Chu, Jinwei Tang, all pretty quick guys. And then the third group is Waterline Racing. Yay. So that was Calvin Lynn, myself in P2, and then Corey Jameson in third. This was our final. John Bowie, the Lizard Man, rode P3 in our quali. So basically, you'll see kind of on the right-hand side, I've done I've done boxes. And so like the red box and the blue box, I think kind of show how these rides were so different. So let's start with like what's really good and what's not so good. So starting with the red box, if you look at the national team, so your far left, right, they went from a 7-1. So these are half lap splits. Sorry, just to be clear, these are half lap splits. So every 125 meters, so you get your first half lap, second half lap, all the way down. So 6 of them in total. If you look at the national team, they basically did a 7-1 and then effectively a 6-7. So they did like a 0.4 drop from their second half lap to their third half lap. And then what you'll notice, and this will be a theme, maybe I'll go a little out of order, is their next 3 half laps are all pretty darn close, right? 6.698, 6.765, 6.745. There's like a little bit of a negative split, or sorry, positive split there, but like within a couple hundred, they are staying pretty consistent. You'll notice that Edge does the same thing. So 6.92, 6.93, 6.898. So that also can happen where if you actually have a stronger rider that sits in your third wheel, they can accelerate just a little bit, but not a whole lot. And then same thing for Waterline, right? We basically went 7.0, 6.9, 7.0. So there's like this chunk in the middle. You're basically second lap and the first half of your third lap, where it's pretty consistent and there's kind of not a lot you can do about it. It's about the speed of your riders, but also about the drop off speed. So sorry, coming back to the red boxes, 7.1, 6. I'm going to call that a 6.7, right? 6.698. So about a 0.4 pickup in speed. If you look at Edge, so that's probably pretty good if you want to do half laps, right? You're still gaining quite a bit of speed there. If you're talking Edge, they go from a 7.2 to a 6.9. So that is not a great gap. It's like a little, I'd say, you want to see a little more pickup in speed, but overall pretty solid. And then pendulum swings, I think, the other way when you look at Waterline, where you went from a 7.6 to a 7.0. And being the rider that went from 7.6 to 7.0, I can tell you, like, I was sitting on the wheel waiting to pounce. And that's not the position you want to be in, right? That's a little conservative. Coming back to my first slide, right? Like, I would rather be conservative than lose it all. And one of these lower ones will show you how that can go terribly wrong. But that is not optimized, right? If I think if he'd been able to ride like a 7.3, I would have been able to ride like a 6.9 or 6.8, right? Just because I had to do actually quite a bit of acceleration, and you can see that sort of difference of actually negative splitting, going from a 7.0 to a 6.9 in the second half lap, which is not ideal, and it's actually the only one of these where you see that. So that is, I think, out there to kind of say, look, that transition from P1 to P2 is really critical. Honestly, it kind of determines a lot of what happens in the race, all riders being equal or similar. And I think that really shows up here in that, like, you had the best transition for the national team. No surprise, they were number 1. Edge had the second best. They were number 2. And lo and behold, we were number 3. Don't pay attention to the rank. That was in the heat, not overall. So, and this was the order in which we finished this year at nationals. But like, these are kind of plain vanilla, I'll call them, that like they all went off more or less the right way, and that's a good thing. And so, like, you see one team better, next team not as good, third team not as good. Pretty straightforward stuff. This bottom row is I'm going to call it like how good teams can go wrong. So the left-hand side, that is actually the exact same ride as before. I just copied it over again just to like highlight things and look at them a little bit more easily. So that's the same ride that I was just talking about that I did at nationals. The middle box, that was a team that called themselves ZZJ. So it was and I'm not doing this to talk poorly about any of these guys. Zach, why is his name escaping me? Josh McDonald, who was my teammate at a couple of these races, and Zeph and Man, Zach. I want to say Galifianakis, but it's obviously not that. Anyhow, and then a team where the team name really didn't work as well as we wanted, but we called it Spam Matsubi. And that was, so Josh McDonald, same guy who rode P2 in the ZZJ team, myself, and Ethan Boys, rest in peace. I see a quote, I see a question. Alex, what was the gearing for Waterline? And if we had to do it again, what would we have geared down? Would we have geared down our P1? So I was on a 106, I want to say a 106 or a 108. Corey, I believe, was on the same or 2 inches bigger. And I think Calvin was on a 96 or a 98. Could we have gone a little faster if we geared him down? Yes. Do I wish we had? Maybe. I am not a fantastic starter. So I'm not a fantastic starter. So I was a little concerned. And part of that was based on what this ride that I'll get into it a little bit. So could we have geared him down? Yes. Calvin also is a very interesting rider, and he knows this in that when he goes 100%, he can maybe eke out a little bit more time, but his sort of like variability index on that is very high. So he can like mess it up quite badly and slip because he's trying to go all in and like lose a full second, right? And so quite deliberately, we asked him to back off and only try to go 95%. And so in doing that, it's also a helpful kind of like put him on a slightly bigger gear just to do that. Also, like he is notorious for having like getting off the line really well, or possibly getting off the line really well, although as you can see, the first half lap splits weren't amazing. And then kind of like not picking up speed. So I wanted him on a bigger gear just to get that kind of exit speed. Also, some of you guys may know this story. I rolled a tire actually in our first qualifying ride, and so had to get up and do it again like 10 minutes later, which almost killed John Bowie, almost killed me. And we were pretty wrecked. And so I think all the more reason to say like we wanted to stick with that more conservative approach. I think quite honestly, like if you look at the final times, right, like a 48.5 versus a 46.5, I don't think we could get down to a 46.5 and take that second spot. Not perfect, right, because we were in the bronze final anyway. So even if we had, it wouldn't have done us any good. But knowing that we could have maybe shaved a couple tenths by gearing him down 2 or 4 inches, that risk reward was not worth it in our minds. So hopefully that helps, right? But like keeps coming back to that same concept. Aaron, I see the question in the chat about gearing. I will come back to that. I do want to talk a little bit about. I'm gonna stick with these numbers for a bit and just talk through these 3 rides. So, and what I want to point out in these rides is if you look at, so like I kept the same red boxes and blue boxes just because I think that like that's a really good way to kind of unpack a team sprint. But I also I added the orange boxes because it shows you, if you look at the 500 meter time, they're really, really similar, right? Like, okay, maybe they're 3/10, like that's actually can be quite a big difference, but like it's not enormous, not compared to some of the other lap times. So a 34.2, a 34.6, and a 34.4, like low to mid 34s, all within kind of spitting distance of one another. How these teams got there to that same 500 mark, and then where they ended up afterwards are all pretty different. What is interesting to me is that, and again, I guess my bias is really coming out in this, and I didn't realize until I started monologuing so much. But the fastest time, both over 500 and overall, in this group was the one with the slowest opening lap. So I take that as, if you ride the rest of it well, you can afford to have a slower opening lap and still have a good team sprint. So I'm not gonna talk too much about the same ride that I did with Waterline on the left anymore. The ZZJ ride, that is a fascinating one, right? Because this guy, so Zach, put in a screaming opening lap. He did it in like a 92-inch gear, or maybe less. He actually might have thrown around an 88, because he wanted to make a point and demonstrate that he could get off the line really well. That put Josh, so Josh McDonald, who is, I don't know how many Masters titles he's won. He's a really good 750 kilo rider. He's also a pretty darn good starter, because he did that first lap in the ride on the right. So he's gone like he's gone sub 20, so 19.6, pretty easily. Like, he's a very good rider. But knowing that in the country was going to put on a really small gear, to make sure that he got on, he had to respond in kind. It's saying my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully you all can hear me. Apologies if not. Josh, to respond to the really small gear, had to put on something much smaller than he had intended, like a 90. I think he ended up riding like a 98, or maybe even smaller than that. He got blown off the wheel, even in spite of that, and then didn't have enough gear to ride a good, for him, 500, right? He basically got on top of it too quickly, and basically got spun out. And you can see this gap, this 7.2, like if you look at the red box here, right, the 7.2 to the 8.1, that's because he was so far behind. Like, he didn't ride an actual 8.1 lap. He probably rode something like a 7.6 or 7.7, but he was so far behind, that he'd already let 3 or 4 tenths go at that point. And so he got so spun out that, actually Zephin, the third rider, ended up overtaking him, and they got disqualified. So this 50.05 time didn't even stand, because they got their gearing wrong and they went out too aggressively and they didn't protect their riders, and it had this really, really rough knock-on effect. And I think what's really interesting about this one is that they knew they were going to do it, and they took a big risk, and they tried to, I'd say, do some other things to account for that risk, which was all suboptimal, and that ended up actually backfiring even worse. Compare that to the far right ride. So that's Josh, myself, and Ethan. Josh got off. I was on a 110, so probably a little overgeared. Josh got off to a really good start. It sure felt like to me, my holder, who had actually dropped me previously, just held on like a little bit too long, because as I got off the line, it felt like he was holding me back. But like, that was enough to totally lose the wheel. And so you can see that, because we had a positive split between Josh's second half lap and my time. And that's, again, not because I was riding a 7.6, but I was riding like a 7.0, but from behind him. Right, there was already like 20 meters that I'd given up. So I basically ended up doing a 500 all on my own. And so I was like, I was definitely in better shape for that ride, for that 500 meters, than I was with my Waterline squad. But I rode it 4 or 2 tenths slower, and dropped Ethan off at a much slower time, or slower speed, than I did for Corey. Again, because we didn't get the start right, because we didn't get the gearing right. It wasn't as pronounced as ZGJ, but you can see how, like, you can take good elements and get them all wrong, and it costs you pretty substantially. So that's really what I had on 250s. I'm going to talk a little bit. Sorry, I just find these things fun. I love the numbers, because I think there's so much you can see and read, especially if you're there and you know the riders, and you can kind of look at like how these things went down. But I think it's just really fun to unpack all the little details. So that's a 250. Let's take all that and talk about gearing. Let's talk about doing it at Marymore, doing it at the Jerry Baker Memorial Velodrome, and how that's different. and like I said, I don't think there's actually a ton to say about it because it's pretty simple. Um, uh, so at home, at our home track, right, it's 400 meters for each rider. What that means is, okay, you're probably not going to truly be able to accelerate for 600 meters. That's hard to do. It's possible, but hard. Um, I think the key differences are you probably gear up a little bit for a couple of reasons, right? One is your first rider, you don't want them to get off the line like a rocket and then spend 200 meters spun out and not accelerating. So, if you are P1, the thing you should think about is what is the maximum gear that you could be accelerating, or sorry, what is the smallest gear that you can be accelerating all the way to the line for 400 meters. It's honestly like if you were to do a chariot race, it'd probably be the same gear or very close, even though you don't have, the throw from someone like Dan Tomko, who like is going to chuck you 20 meters at the start. But so you want to gear up and be really, really conscientious of the fact that you don't want to park the bus, particularly early in the race. Uh, all the more important than at our track to protect your second and especially your third rider. So order, I think you could, you can play it like a little on the pointy end with rider order in like on a 250, but for sure you need to make sure that you've got your longest rider, or sorry, your rider who can do the longest speed tacked on at the back, no matter kind of what you're doing. And even if that's not perfect, just because it's 400 meters in that final lap, like you need someone who can go that distance. I think also team selection wise, like that person doesn't need to be a sprinter, should not be a sprinter or a pure sprinter, like a good sprint Duro type. And we have a lot of those at our track. Like that is a great P3 at Marymore. Gearing wise, I would say if you are P2 or P3, I would go kilo gear or slightly bigger. If you're P1, a little smaller. So let's talk about what that means for me, and then hopefully, if like you can sort of like adjust up or down based on your own knowledge or where your own gear preferences are. And then Ken, I see the question on gearing there or gearing for our team. So I'll try to cover all of those at once. So typically at our track, I will race mass starts in about a 100 inch or 102. I will do sprint rounds, so match sprints on like a 110, and then qualifying will be somewhere 118 to 122. Kilo, I don't really ride kilos anymore. I guess I'll get back to it, I suppose. The last ones I was also doing on a 110, so the same as my match sprint gear. I'll probably gear those up a little bit just to see how that goes, but like a 110. So that is kind of what I've ridden historically. So like 110 is kind of like my sprinter's sweet spot, I'll call it. So doing a team sprint at the JBMB, I would put on a 110. I would have rider, if I were myself riding P1, I would do like a 102 to 104. Because I can keep accelerating that. I think if you get spun out a little bit, then you might go up to all the way up to like a 106. And then again, if I were myself riding P3, I wouldn't go much bigger, but you could, if you really like to like push a big gear, right? Because like you're gonna try to really take the that initial sharpness out of the start, you can afford to ride a pretty big gear as P2 or P3 for that matter. So I would now that's if you're a good starter, right? I think Bowie was P3. We all know Bowie is so Bowie's faster than me overall, but not as good of a starter. So he probably it depends on how good your starter is. he was either on the same gear or maybe even a 108, just because he's also comfortable spinning a little bit higher cadence at those absolute max speeds. On the track, on a short track, right? So this is down in LA. As P2, I rode a 106. I think Calvin was on a 98 and Corey was on like on a 108. I think if I were a better starter, I would like to ride like a 108, 110, but at the moment I'm not. Though, as you can see, just like in that bottom row, even though I think I like a bigger gear, I ended up going quite a bit faster on a slightly smaller gear where I could catch the start better. Even in my final lap or half lap split being the end of lap 2, right, it was about 2/10 faster on a smaller gear. Again, just because it was a cleaner ride and able to stay in the wheel better and not be out in the wind. So that is a lot about gearing. That is a lot about riding 3 laps. I'm going to pause. Aaron, I didn't have anything else I really wanted to cover. I think we got to most of the stuff in the Q&A.
Yeah,
I know.
a couple of questions that folks submitted ahead of time if we wanted to chat through those.
Great, let's do it.
Before we get into that though, there are folks who are eager to hear about gearing. You just gave a really great explanation of gearing. Any follow-up questions that people have about picking the right gear? Maybe we'll give people a chance to submit those questions in the chat. Something that came up beforehand, people said, how do you select who's going to be in what position if you're assembling a team at a championship?
Yeah. And so I think it depends on like what championship we're talking about. I think it depends on what length track we're talking. And so, you know, like there's no great answer, right? Like I don't think there's a like formulaic thing, but the thing I would say, like, you always want to keep in mind in all of these decisions, whether it's team order, team selection, or gearing, is how good of a starter everyone is, what sort of top speed everyone has, what sort of endurance everyone has, and then what. So that's 3. I'm going to go to a list of 5. 4 is like how long the track is, and 5 is like what are the stakes and what do you know about the other teams. And so what I mean by that is if you were going to if you were going to like to Fred's and you're doing, say, a Masters team sprint and there's like one other team, right? And you think you have a pretty solid group that you can feel good about. Then your team selection race, you want to try to get the 3 fastest people you can together. This is one of those like make friends, send people messages on Instagram beforehand, buddy up with folks. Josh, Ethan, and I were going to be team sprinting like a year out from LA. We knew that we just like wanted to put ourselves together as a team. So there's an element of just like find the 3 fastest people you can and try to make that happen. Team order is if you think you've got the number of the other team, play it conservative. So really emphasize the back half of the race in terms of having your speed there. If you think you need everything possible, everything in your power to really like eke out the win or eke out the placing or the best time, then you push your faster riders a little earlier and hope that you can hang on. Yeah, gearing wise, I think it's kind of the same, right? If you're worried, gear everyone up a little bit, or gear up your early riders and gear down your P2, P3. Again, that's just the safe play. What sort of position and speed, like what sort of profiles are you looking for? I mean, ideally, if you have a really good starter, you have one and you put them P1. Your P2, like typically you will see a strong association with your fastest flying 200-meter time is your P2 rider. And if you have like a really good kilo rider who's got a good say 3rd and 4th lap on a 250, then that sort of rider makes for a good P3. probably a little bit more relevant for our track. Like a good Kieran rider is a really good P3 on a 250. And like a good enduro, like a good sprinting enduro, someone who's going to race like a good scratch race is a good P3 there.
Cool. And I think in line with that, some folks were asking any lessons from championship races or advice for doing a team sprint at a championship event for the first time. So one thing that you mentioned is you rolled a tire and you waited for all the other heats to go, and then you had to go do it again. Like are there any other advice that you have about just kind of the logistics and layout of a championship that to help folks if they're doing this for the first time?
Yeah. So depending on the championship, so at nationals, this is true. At worlds, this was not because we didn't have enough teams, but technically it sort of starts out this way. Is you can have qualifying. So setting aside like the world championship, which is not relevant to our audience, like elite world championships, um, typically most high level championships will go qualifier then final, and you can have four riders and substitute somebody in. And so that actually ended up being really valuable for us at Waterline, because we had, excuse me, Calvin was our rider one, I went rider two, and then we actually swapped between rounds between John and Corey as our rider three. You can't actually, so I guess first piece of advice, don't roll a wheel. Check your tires are glued, and that they're glued properly, and they were glued more recently than 2019. I was on borrowed wheels. It wasn't great. Also, don't kiss the Côte d'Azur. That also doesn't help. But it would not have mattered. Like so Corey was in his like street clothes at the time. We could not have put Corey in as man three, or sorry, rider three. In that heat, you have to run it the exact same way with the exact same lineup. We had like a good hour between our qualifier and our final, which was probably enough to be recovered. But and I don't mean to be sharing his personal data. I mean, I guess I do because I'm going to do it. But Bowie said that he hit a max heart rate of 236 beats per minute in our second ride. And Andy has a picture. I couldn't even get off the track. I was like laid out on the ramp out of the infield. So doing two rides back to back is really hard. And so having a third or having a fourth rider that you can swap in is very helpful. And so I think like that is one thing, is if you can do that and have a 4-person team, do it. The risk, though, again, all these things, right? Risk reward. If you don't have a fourth rider who is similarly fast, then it gets dicey, because you just don't know, like, who do you put in qualifier? Who do you like? Because, sorry, I should be explicit about this. If you do quali, then final, the top two qualifying teams ride for gold and silver, no matter, and 3 and 4 ride for bronze. It does not matter what your lap time is or your final time is. Like, you cannot, if you're in the bronze medal final, you cannot do better than bronze. So 2021, which is at T-Town, Andrew Carlberg, Bowie, and I did a team sprint, and we raced a team that it was called ASCP, which is the American Sprint Cycling Program. It was basically like the old part of, well, actually, a lot of the guys are on the national team now, but it was the old Olympic Development Program. And they got it wrong because they blew their third rider off the wheel. And so in qualifying, they almost didn't even qualify for the bronze medal ride. And then in the final, they did the same thing, but we also didn't get our order exactly right, because of rain. Bowie had to go from the Omnium points race straight into our team sprint final, or qualifier, and we put him on the third lap, and he was a pretty broken individual by that point, which was not great. And so we actually ended up having the second fastest time of the entire race, but only took a bronze medal. And so, it's a risk to try to keep something in reserve in terms of like a faster rider or a faster lineup in your qualifying race, because if you don't get into that top two, then the best you can do is bronze, and things can go pretty poorly pretty quickly. Those are like the main pieces of advice. I think trying to do a little bit together, and you don't have to do everything, right? You don't have to ride a whole team sprint, but it's like knowing how everyone gets off the line together, how you slot in, making sure you feel pretty confident in that. Like, I think those are all good things to practice for like a championship event. I'm seeing some stuff up here. Stan, do we go over starting as a team on our track? Yeah, I think one thing, Stan, just to sorry, I guess, Aaron, before I move on, anything else that comes to mind that I'm not thinking of for championship type formats? That's the big one. I guess, sorry, the last thing I will say on that is that is a good time to remember that P2 is not necessarily easier than P3. It really depends on like your rider profile. There was a world in which we thought, and I'd still be curious to test this out, where like our best lineup might have actually been for me to not do P2 again, and then for like Corey to come in as a really fresh P2, and have him like go Calvin, Corey, John. Given how much we put on John, because of the roll tire and the re-ride, like that would not have been the best in that situation, but like maybe in isolation it would have been. So just all things to think about, right? It's like really hard to know. Stan, so in terms of starting together as a team, so I'll talk about it as like a 250, then a little bit as a 400. So on a 250, right, assuming there's a start gate, rider one is in a gate, 2 and 3 are held by typically officials. It's not always the case. It's supposed to be official. The best advice is if you are P2 or P3, you are racing your teammates to the corner, and you are racing them in a straight line. A lot of times what I see happen, which is not ideal, is the first rider gets out of the gate pretty well, and the second rider goes straight down track to get on that wheel. And that's not what you want to do, in part because it's really hard to have good start technique while also turning left. And because like it means that their mind is going somewhere else and they're already thinking about another rider. Like you are trying to win that drag race to the corner. And so, you blast off the line, going straight ahead. And then on a 250, like I say, try to stay up basically until you're getting to the entrance of the corner. P3 might come down a little bit early just because if they are on a particularly big gear. But if you watch the world-class teams, they are staying pretty well side by side through most of that, half of a straightaway before starting to fall into line. It's also this is very true of me, and I've seen it with some riders where they might not get out of the gate right or particularly well, but there's like a certain cadence range where they find another gear is sort of like a that's a bad term to use here because you're obviously not finding another gear, but like they hit a point where they can go quite a bit faster and they can accelerate. And so like the big risk is you think you're on the wheel and you start to relax. And that, like, if you start to relax and kind of take your foot off the gas and the other rider's really accelerating, and that's when they really hit like their peak power or their ability to kind of take off, and you've sort of like shut it down a little bit, that's when you can get into real trouble. And so I think, like, again, bias and risk aversion from my perspective is stay on the gas a little harder if you're, well, actually, I'm going to pause. The conservative way to do it is stay on the gas a little harder and stay a little higher to make sure that you have like a little something so you don't drop the wheel. In a perfect world, if you have the opportunity to really know your team together, practice together, you actually want P2 to be geared heavily enough such that they don't actually catch the wheel until they're coming out of turn 4. So like in an ideal world, I as P2 would still be, 100% like full gas out of the saddle, trying everything to get myself up to speed. Calvin would be 2 or maybe even 3 or 4 bike lengths ahead of me, and then I'm closing that gap as we get towards the end of the back straightaway and through the turn. And then really, like, when you watch the Dutch, you watch the Australians. Um, uh, I would say you watch the Chinese women, but their starter is so good they almost never catch her. The German women do a really good job of this too. They're catching that the second and third rider are like a close group right together, and they are catching the first rider basically right as they hit the line. That's really hard to do, and it takes practice. And of course, those are national federations where they train together. That's ideal. That is like, but if you get that wrong, you can gain like a tenth or two from it. If you get it wrong, you can lose like 5 or 6 tenths. And so that's why I go the slightly more conservative route of gear up a little bit, fall in, gear your first rider up a little bit, fall in, and have like a slightly easier ride, and just gives you that little bit of chance to like catch your breath, prepare, and then like as you come out of that turn, grip it and rip it. How are we doing? Really interesting gearing the P2B. I'm not sure what ham and egg means, Ken, but
Yeah, so I think Ken was saying great talk and kind of agreeing with some of the things that you were saying. But Ken, I'm not quite sure if there's a question in there. So if there is, go ahead and put it in the chat, put the question in the chat. This is the last question we have from the pre-submitted questions. So to all of our attendees, if you have a question you'd like for Alex to answer, now is the time to put it in the chat, because we'll talk about this question, and if we don't see anything else come in, we'll go ahead and wrap up. So the last pre-submitted question we got was around start gates and any advice for start gates, especially since we don't have them at JBMV.
My one big piece of advice is a start gate. There is the so the way it works is there's like a hydraulic clamp that holds your bike in place, right? It holds your rear wheel and usually holds like at the seat post. And then it's connected to the timer. And the hydraulic clamp and the timer are not exactly synced up. So you can actually hear, if you listen really closely, right, you hear the beeps, like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 beeps, and boop. First of all, it goes at 0, not 1. And then you can actually hear the psst of the hydraulic releasing, and pay attention to that like at every track, because you will notice how those are synced differently. So sometimes they're a touch late, sometimes they're a touch early. So just like know when that's coming in. 2 is no, it's actually not all that different. I think if you're good at starting, being held by an individual, you'll be good from a start gate. You could put more into it, but I just think like build your tension early is kind of like the build your tension. And like a lot of people like to really rock back and go forward. And my problem with that is when you rock back, you sort of like lose, it's easy to lose tension in your body and you don't get out of the gate very well. So I actually don't really rock very much. I just sort of sit and like grab and build that and try to like use that to effectively have it at the ready. Other metrics you look at in training useful for, I just look at like start times, half laps, quarter laps are helpful, and then flying 200s. Like those are the things that are easy for everyone to get. Sorry, that's in response to Tyson's question.
Well, and Tyson's question was, are there any metrics that you look at in training that are useful for understanding potential team sprint performance? So thank you for answering that. Cool. Ken has a question. I can read it aloud. In your example, you knew Calvin and what his tendencies were, and still it didn't quite work out. I've seen many team sprint assembled over the phone or in field, and when there's a big gap, boom.
Yeah, I think that's right, Ken. I think I actually disagree. I think it did work out for us. The only thing that didn't work out really was like us rolling a tire. I think given the riders we had, like we rode that about as well as we possibly could. I think it was like, honestly, I'm super proud of Calvin for sort of being realistic and sanguine about like the way he rides, and being very mature about like, I'm gonna take it at 95%. I'm gonna just deliver a smooth ride more than trying to like ride 100% and maybe risk it. And I think we like pretty much nailed that. And So I actually like, I agree with your overall sentiment about like team sprints, and I think a lot of that can come from people just having too much ego, and I think that's where people can get it wrong. You know, we got the most out of our ride because I think we were all really clear eyed about like what we couldn't do. And I see now that John is on this call, so which I didn't know before. But when we had to go up for our re-ride, you know, Calvin was fresh. Like doing a standing 250, that's not like that hurts, but you can get up and do it again, and do it pretty much at 100%. John and I were pretty already wrecked, knowing that we were just gonna have to survive. And all we had to do at that point was get into the top four. I don't think we knew at that time that that one of the teams had been disqualified. We knew we didn't have to go super fast. We just knew we had to put together a good ride, and that we were already in like the hurt locker. And so like we told Calvin, hey, you got to take even more off this, like, because we need you to deliver us smoothly, rather than having something to prove. And so I think just like having that really good communication was critical. That's why it's a team sport. All right.
Cool. Any other questions from folks? Otherwise, I believe there's still a quarter left in the Seahawks game that we could all go watch.
All right. Go Hawks. And go Huskies. A little early for it, but hey.
Alex, thank you so much for joining. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for being part of this series. Folks, if you have any more questions or recommendations for this winter series that we're doing, feel free to reach out to Amar or me. We'd love to chat.